Hello, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue with our in-depth study of Acts. Recall that Paul, Silas, and Timothy are on their second missionary journey, and they are in Europe now, mainly the Roman province of Macedonia at the time, which is be Greek culture, and are beginning to move in to some of the Greek area proper, although it had different names at that time under Roman rule, where they have encountered success with the people. They're converting some of the local people as well as the diaspora Jewish population. These Gentiles that are there now are Hellenistic, that is, very Greek cultured Gentiles, both race-wise and culturally. And the diaspora Jews, although ethnically, they are Jews, they are culturally Hellenistic also. However, the Jewish community has expelled them, forcing Paul especially to escape for his safety. Silas and Timothy had stayed behind there to minister a while, but Paul has escaped south towards the sea and is now in Athens, but has sent word for Timothy and Silas to join him ASAP. So let's read, starting chapter 17, verses 16 to the end of that chapter. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogues with the Jews and the devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Also some Epicureans and some Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be proclaiming a foreign divinity to them." This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means." Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them altars with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestry he made all nations to inhabit the world, the whole earth, and he allotted the time of their existence and the boundaries of their places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our beings, as even some of you, your own poets, have said. For we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals, while God has overlooked the times of human ignorance. Now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and at this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. When they heard the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, "We will hear you again about this." At that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius and an Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. At that time in Athens was one of the, at the time we're writing here, or not necessarily writing, but the time that Paul is supposed to be there and performing these talks. Athens was one of the major centers of Greek philosophy and thought. The schools of Socrates, of Plato, and Aristotle were there, as were major academic academies and prized institutions of learning and religion. The Epicureans are mentioned here, who reduced life into only its things of pleasure, and the Stoics, who thought things through from a logical standpoint. In other words, everything had to be logical. These groups and these schools all had widespread appeal there in 1st century AD. Sanctuaries, though, were also there to the multiple religions, as were monuments to many gods, which Paul labels in some translations, or Luke labels, as idols. That term, idols, scholars say, clearly reflects this monotheistic perspective of Paul, that is the Judeo-Christian paradigm, notes many scholars. It does not fit the philosophical paradigm that existed in this community. Dr. Carl Holliday of Emory University teaches that Luke is describing this in a predatory sense when looked at from the pagan perspective. It is not that these pagans are non-religious, I should say. Rather, they have the wrong religion relative to the Judeo-Christian mindset. Dr. William Willimon says, Paul has arrived at the university town, so to speak, so can the gospel be successfully presented here in this intellectually diverse environment is a key question encountered here in Luke. That's kind of the setting. And many scholars note that this is one of the crossroads in the book of Acts. The Judeo-Christian paradigm has now gone through a series of tests, and now it's placed at the test in front of the what we might call the academic community. This derogatory or predatory interpretation is here as presented, as a way they would look at it in part, many scholars say. One scholar, but Loke presents Paul's presentation in a very logical approach. It's well presented here. One scholar suggests the modern day image of this might be interpreted as a sort of a fire and brimstone type preacher, a graduate of some Bible school, who suddenly shows up on an academic town, roaming the streets and presenting his theology for those around. Athenians were known as being very intellectually curious people. Writings everywhere tend to support this concept. They were very learned people and they were very curious. Clearly, it appears this educated community is, though ignorant, at least presented in this point, ignorant of Jesus as the Messiah and his resurrection. Now, they're not ignorant of the concept of resurrection. That's an implied understanding here, scholars say. What it is, it's they're not aware of this idea that Jesus supposedly has been resurrected. They're going to want to hear more about that. They want to correct that ignorance by learning all they can. Yet, this wording, new teaching, that's here, scholars say, carries special concerns relative to Roman law and Greek culture. As at that time and place, these highly suspicious people were very suspicious of any new religion, any new teaching, especially if it was coming from the East, and to them, this religion be coming from the East, or this concept coming from the East. And why was this? The Greek culture had been rocked years earlier by religious propaganda coming mainly out of Iran, or the Persian people, which it seemed, and out of India, out of those general areas. And they had to sort this out, and they basically came up with a theory or approach of how to sort things out by, if a religion seemed to be totally new and didn't have a historical foundation, they rejected almost outright. So part of what Paul is doing here is establishing a historical background for the Judeo-Christian paradigm. Thus, Dr. Holliday notes that Luke points out that Paul is establishing the historical base for this new religion, Christianity, as being undergirded in the Old Testament, a long-standing Israelite religion. Paul is distressed because he sees these people are worshiping idols of their many gods, which would be a sin in the Judeo-Christian faith. There, Pegasus was where they have him come to. This was a equivalent of a Athenian high intellectual court. In other words, this is where you come to really sort it out. It may have had some implications of a court of law also, but it was a court of, first of all, let's sort out the philosophy. Let's come to the academic understanding of what's going on. Thus, Paul is called before them to explain, in the presence of so-called the better minds of the community, his new teaching. Notice this approach is first to acknowledge that these people are extremely religious. He sees all evidence that they're worshiping many gods. But he captures on an interesting idea. You have one statue to an unknown God. And he's going to make the point, this God of Israel, this God that has selected Jesus and resurrected him, it's this unknown God that I'm telling you about. Paul seemed to use that unknown God, open idea, and then plug the story of the Israelite Christian paradigm into that, very carefully weaving it to fill in that role of the unknown God. Then he announces they have been worshiping these little gods all along out of ignorance of the correct God. And that God has called now for everyone, everywhere, to repent and follow this proper God. That God has appointed a righteous man, Jesus the Messiah, who he raised from the dead as the judge of humans at some point in time. Some scholars note that this most important episode is the most important episode in Luke's narrative on the second missionary journey, not because of what Paul preached or the thought per se, but because it is a face-off between the high-cultured, educated Greco-Roman philosophical society with the fundamentals of this religion. Dr. Robert Wall says this is the center of learning at that time that greatly influenced Greek Hellenistic culture. So Christianity will have to be sorted out in this philosophical environment to survive and advance in the Hellenistic European culture. Paul has put the teachings on the table, so to speak, and let it wiggle. Notice he seems to depart the scene pretty quickly. No evidence of a threat towards him. It's as if he's presented it, they have to sort it out. So that's where he seems to leave it there. Several scholars suggest it is the fleshing out of this new idea that has been presented here, that Paul leaves it for them to sort out in greater detail, which Paul himself does in the book of Romans. Several scholars say this is kind of the leftover part, and the book of Romans, which is the first writing of Paul's writing, not his first one to write, but it is the one that's ordered in our Testament, is Paul's version of sorting it out. Several scholars suggest Luke has likely taken much liberty, though, in writing this story of Athens. They have a hard time seeing Paul sparring with the Athenian philosophers, as presented here. The majority of scholars suggest that it just does not seem to fit Paul. Not that he wasn't capable of it, it just doesn't seem to be his approach. And he does not highlight this activity in Berea anywhere in his writings, the authentic Pauline writings. Instead, Paul teaches very much, the teachings that Paul normally teach rely very heavily on apocalyptic eschatology rather than on philosophy. Thus, Dr. Luke Timothy Johnson of Emory University suggests that Luke has likely written an idealized version of what ought to have happened when Christianity meets Greek philosophy. And that's the approach that he presents then to Theophilus for whatever sorting out that Theophilus needs to do relative to this religion. This ending is most interesting, notes Dr. Wall. The resurrection issue triggers a rule that they will hear you again on this, expecting to hear this on multiple debates. But Paul does not show up, or at least there's no indication here that he will be showing up for a second debate. Because there was, in part, the reason they want to hear this out, you have multiple sections. That's to mention these Stoics who are going to be looking at things from a very of their day and time, a scientific or natural occurring logical reason for why this would be. There was a strong Stoic culture at the time and place. They find nothing in their knowledge base that would cause them to reasonably expect such of a possible interpretation, much less for even possibly to even happen. So Luke says Paul just seems to leave it there. They've got to sort it out. There's nothing else he can say. Was Paul not ready then to present this argument on the grounds of faith? Was it Paul that wasn't quite ready for further experience? After all, he didn't necessarily end up here because he planned to go there. He ended up there escaping trouble from where he did intend to go. So scholars tend to ask that question. What is the reason that he left without showing up a second time? And why is this particular aspect of the story not developed further in Paul's own writings? I'll leave it there for you. That seems to be where the scholars, several of the scholars anyway, picked this story. They all pretty well note that what Paul presents for us Christians seems to fit pretty well. But we have to recognize we do not have the mindset of these philosophers that were there. Hope you have a good study, and we'll see you in another lesson.